About a month ago, I posted a poll asking you guys if I should read Dune for my next book, and you overwhelmingly said yes. To be honest, it was going to happen either way. I've gone way too long without reading it, and I was such a huge fan of the movie that there was no way I wasn't going to pick up this book eventually. Honestly, I don't really know why I posted the poll, except maybe to give you the illusion that you have some control over my destiny when you don't. But either way, I am incredibly glad that I did finally get around to reading this book. And especially I'm glad that I got around to reading it before the new movie is coming out, because I have a strong feeling that it's really going to contribute to my enjoyment of that movie. And I am even more excited for it now than I was before. So a quick flashback to 2021. I saw Dune when it first came out, and I didn't really know much about it going in, except that it was this big science fiction phenomenon and that I wasn't going to miss it for the world. I had seen only one other Denis Villeneuve movie before then, which was Arrival, and I love that movie. So I sort of had some idea what to expect when it comes to style, but I was just absolutely blown away by that movie. It was a cinematic experience like I had not had in a long time. From a purely stylistic perspective, it feels like Denis Villeneuve makes movies that are perfectly tailored to my own taste. They have the most perfect pacing I've ever seen in movies. They just move so delightfully slow and allow you to soak in all the details of the delightful worlds he creates, which are so tactile and real in a way that most modern movies don't feel. And with Hans Zimmer's incredible score, that movie is just an overwhelming experience. And for months after seeing it, I was just listening to the soundtrack constantly and unable to get it out of my head, because I was just obsessed with that movie. And even though the story itself felt somewhat familiar, the style of the film is such that the whole universe just feels so mysterious, and this experience that Paul has going from the planet he's lived on his entire life to an entirely new planet just feels so dire and profound in that movie. And every scene just has such a strong rhythm to it that it's an intoxicating movie. So you might notice that my love for the film comes a lot from the stylistic choices of the director. And I think that's largely part of the reason I put off reading the book until now, because I wasn't sure if I loved Dune just because it was such a well-made movie, or if I would love it in a book format as much. Fortunately, now that I'm here, I can say that I absolutely love the book just as much. Sometimes for different reasons, sometimes for the same reasons, but either way, I think that the book and the movie work incredibly well together in a way that most book-to-movie adaptations don't. So because of how much I love the movie, I went into the book feeling like I already knew a decent amount about the characters and a little bit about the world building. Which is to say, I wasn't caught completely off guard by the fact that some characters have names like Duncan, Idaho, which I absolutely would have been if I had gone in without any context, because what is up with that name? But even so, I was feeling pretty lost for the first 100 pages or so of this novel, and having a really hard time getting into it, because for one thing, Frank Herbert's prose is just a little bit weird. Certainly not bad, but just it has a weird rhythm to it that was a little bit hard for me to get past. I'll talk more about that in a bit, actually. But the other reason is that there were some minor differences from the movie that caught me completely off guard, like how the Baron, who in the movie is this incredibly menacing antagonist who dominates every scene that he's in and feels like a genuine threat to the characters. In the book, he sort of feels like this almost comic book style villain. He's like a mustache twirling count type figure who's always going on about how intelligent he is and how his plans are going to bring about the end of the Atreides family once and for all. And it felt a bit comic compared to the movie. But I think one of the things that caught me the most off guard was the way that this book feels so much more steeped in the real world than the movie version of Dune does. The references to Islamic culture, for instance, are so much more prevalent in this book, to the extent that you have characters speaking a language that is literally just Arabic but slightly different. And that doesn't even just apply to the Fremen, but also to the Imperium as a whole. The fact that you have phrases like jihad and wider use throughout the galaxy really shows how Frank Herbert was inspired by Muslim culture for the entirety of his world building. And then there's all this business about the Orange Catholic Bible and Buddhism and the Zen Sunni religion, and all these just phrases that feel slightly familiar, but also are completely thrown out of context. And the effect of all this is that I was just feeling very lost and a little bit frustrated at the beginning of this book. Once I finally adapted to it, though, the themes of this book became just endlessly fascinating. The first example I can think of the book being so much richer in a lot of ways than the movie is the Gom Jabbar scene, which in the book is the very first scene. Because after Paul survives the Gom Jabbar test, there's this whole passage where the Reverend Mother is talking about how she was trying to tell whether he is an animal or whether he's a human. And it's all sort of related to this 10,000-year history of the Bene Gesserit and the Butlerian Jihad. And what I find so interesting is that her line about how an animal caught in a trap will bite off its own leg to escape made it into the movie, but the entire broader context of that line, how this test is really a way of weeding out animals from humans, whatever that means, is sort of just like not there in the movie, and it has like a different, more shallow meaning. But yeah, with the themes in this book as a whole, it felt like a weird mixture of profundity and nonsense, if that makes sense. Like, there are some quotes in this book that strike me as very true, and then other quotes that maybe seem somewhat true, but not really. And then other themes in this book just feel like nonsense to me, or else I'm just completely unable to parse them. An example of something that falls sort of in the middle is this quote about how the concept of progress is a lie we tell ourselves to prevent ourselves from fearing the future, which sounds very profound and is sort of true, because I certainly don't think that progress is inevitable or that the future will inevitably be better than the past. And this idea that the future will be better than the past is definitely a sort of fiction that we tell ourselves sometimes to make ourselves feel like everything is going to be okay in the end. But at the same time, the concept of progress itself isn't at all an illusion, I think. Like, the world has gotten a lot better since the Middle Ages, and I think there's a very real sense in which it can get a lot better in an objective way. One thing that bugged me a little bit, although I'll admit I had some preformed opinions about this before coming in, is this idea that the Fremen and the Sardaukar are such excellent warriors because of the harsh conditions in which they live, which is pretty central to the premise of this book. Like, without giving too much away, the plot of the book revolves heavily around this idea that the Fremen, because of the environment they were raised in, can become a fighting force as great as the Sardaukar. And a lot of the political machinations surrounding Arrakis are not only because of the spice, but also because of the harsh environment that it poses and the kind of overwhelming effect it has on the human mind. The thing is, from an anthropological perspective, this doesn't really make any sense. This idea that living in a harsh environment makes you like a more noble or more competent people isn't really true historically. And when I say I had preformed opinions about this going in, I'm referring to a series of blog posts I read quite a while before reading this post called The Fremen Mirage, which I strongly recommend to anyone interested in the intersections between history and pop culture. And this whole series of posts is kind of about debunking this myth that people who live in extremely harsh conditions are going to be better fighters or, you know, let alone better people. It's a really great blog. I'll put a link down in the description. There's a lot of posts about Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones and other franchises as well. But anyway, going back to the prose in this book, I heard a lot of people saying that Frank Herbert's prose was bad before going in, which was another reason I was wondering how much I was going to like this book. But I certainly don't think it's bad at all. It's fascinating and complex, and it's hard to get through and hard to understand at times. But I think the sort of mystery embedded within the prose actually adds to the reading experience. I think the book is stronger because it's written in such a strange way where you can't understand every sentence the first time you read it. In the afterword to the book, Brian Herbert, Frank Herbert's son, says that his father wrote a lot of the scenes in this book in the form of poetry before converting them into prose. And yeah, like, it shows. It's certainly not the best written prose I've ever read, but it has this like unique quality to it that is sort of easy to get obsessed with. I don't know, it just feels right for this book. And every scene has this weird flow to it where it goes in and out of different characters' perspectives. The book is written, for those who don't know, in the third person omniscient. There is no one POV character for every chapter in this book. Instead, it flows freely between different people. And that free-flowing style, the way it jumps in and out of thoughts and between different characters, it all just, it just works. It feels like you're reading things that you shouldn't be reading sometimes. And yeah, I like that experience. To give you an example of what I'm talking about, I want to take a look at this scene where Paul's visions are described in detail for the first time. And what I find so fascinating about this scene is that the description of his visions happens in the middle of a conversation between him and Jessica. And throughout the conversation, Paul is just like totally out of it. Like, he is tripping, and Jessica is like trying to talk to him, and it keeps switching between their conversation and his visions. And you can see that Jessica, when you go into her mind, she's really just concerned for him and sort of almost panicking, because she's realizing that, you know, he's the Kwisatz Haderach. He has this weird ability to see into the future that she doesn't understand. And all of these elements just come together in the most beautiful way. And then we get this passage here where we actually get to see what Paul's visions look like, that I'm just going to read. He remembered once seeing a gauze kerchief blowing in the wind, and now he sensed the future as though it twisted along some surface as undulant and impertinent as that of the wind-blown kerchief. He saw people. He saw the heat and cold of uncounted probabilities. He knew names and places, experienced emotions without number, reviewed data of innumerable unexplored crannies. There was time to probe and test and taste, but no time to shape. The thing was a spectrum of possibilities, from the most remote past to the most remote future, from the most probable to the most improbable. He saw his own death in countless ways. He saw new planets, new cultures, people. He saw them in such swarms they could not be listed, yet his mind cataloged them. Paul is just going insane in this scene. He sees so many futures laid out before him, but he's not able to see them in enough detail to give him much predictive power to make his ability even useful, because, like the kerchief in the wind, it moves and changes over time, and he's able to see some futures sometimes, and other futures he's not able to see at all, ever. And the way he just has this mental breakdown in the middle of a conversation, it's just, I don't know, it just works. Like, it's so weird and profound. And this scene in particular just really blew me away. I think it was the first scene in the book where I'm like, okay, I am all in now. And from that point on, I just kept becoming more and more obsessed with this book. There was just no going back after that scene. Okay, so until now, I was mostly avoiding talking about spoilers, but from here on out, it's gonna be all spoilers, because I really want to talk about the events at the end of this book and what I thought of those, so you have been warned. All right, so the first thing that I want to address is this notion that Dune is a hero's journey type story, because I kept hearing that over and over again before going in. I kept hearing people say, the first book is like a classic hero's journey, and then the rest of the books are just Frank Herbert going insane. And I don't know what book you guys read, but this is not a hero's journey, like even remotely. In a hero's journey type story, there's usually some sort of prophecy about the main character doing some great thing, and the rest of the story is about them trying to live up to that prophecy. Even if they reject it at first, they eventually live up to it. Whereas this book has a prophecy about Paul becoming like a genocidal maniac, and the entire point of the book is that he's trying to stop that from happening. I don't understand how this is a hero's journey. He rescues the Fremen from the Harkonnens, sure, but in that ending scene, he really is just a totally different person than he is at the beginning of the book. He's become cold, and he's acting, you know, like a complete jerk to Irulan, who he's marrying specifically for political purposes. And it feels like he's really become exactly what he didn't want to become. This sort of cold, calculating figure who is willing to do morally questionable things to fulfill his own ends. It almost sounds a little bit like a certain character from The Wheel of Time, if I may make that comparison, which I can't help myself from making. So yeah, I did not see Paul as like your typical self-insert character. In fact, he has very little internality for most of this book. The perspective in the book jumps around so much that it's sort of hard to get into his head, and when you are in his head, you feel like you're going insane. This is a very unusual type of story. With all that being said, I am super ready to go into Dune Messiah, because I really want to figure out, you know, what all this jihad business is about. I want to figure out what Paul is going to do next. I went into this book knowing that Paul was going to have a darker turn in Dune Messiah, and so that definitely did influence my perception of him and his story. Maybe if I hadn't known that going in, then I wouldn't have felt as strongly about this not being a hero's journey narrative. But I think there were still enough like really obvious clues that, I don't know, I wouldn't have felt that this was a normal hero's journey. Especially how in the appendix, the author writes that Arrakis was afflicted by a savior. That's such a strange word to use if you want us to be on board with Paul and his actions. Why would you say that Arrakis was afflicted by a savior if that wasn't clearly a bad thing? So I want to quickly go over now just some of my favorite parts of this book, because there were so many standout scenes for me. And funnily enough, a lot of my favorite scenes in the movie were somewhat forgettable in the book and vice versa. And it was a really pleasant experience getting to read a whole lot of scenes that were cut from the movie and getting to see all these interactions that presumably in the movie are going on the side, but that we don't really get to see. One of these scenes is the dinner party scene, which I really loved. It gave us a sense that the world of Arrakeen is a lot more politically complex than we see in the movie. And I loved Paul's interactions with the dinner guests in this scene. It was just a really fun, intense section of the book before, you know, everything goes wrong immediately afterwards. And then there was also this entire plotline that was cut from the movie about Thufir Hawat and Gurney Halleck suspecting Jessica of being the traitor who allowed the Harkonnens to attack Arrakeen. And with respect to that, I really loved the confrontation between Hawat and Jessica at the end of part 1 of this book, where Jessica just sort of reveals her full Bene Gesserit powers and just completely dominates him in this conversation. And he's completely taken aback. Hawat is a much more formidable character in the book than he was, or than he seemed in the movie at least. And yet even here, he's just like, it seems like he was completely unaware of how powerful Jessica and her abilities with the voice are. And that was just a really fun interaction to see. Although it does kind of make me hate Thufir Hawat, unfortunately, because he just gets completely duped into believing this conspiracy theory that the Baron is trying to get him to believe. And it's all a little bit embarrassing. Same with Gurney Halleck in that later scene where he confronts Jessica and tries to kill her. I already talked about the scene where Paul and Jessica are in the tent immediately after the raid and he's revealing her visions. That was definitely one of my favorite scenes. But then I loved Jameis's funeral scene and the way that Paul sheds water for him. You know, that was a really tender moment, and it's nice to see that the effect that Paul killing a man has on him is so incredibly powerful. And it's one of those scenes that really makes you empathize a lot with Paul, of which I feel like there aren't that many. Probably my favorite scene in the book, though, is the scene where Jessica receives the memories of the old Reverend Mother, because man, that scene, everything that I was talking about with Frank Herbert's prose being weird and easy to get obsessed with, it all comes to the forefront in that scene. It just has this utterly bizarre rhythm to it, and you just get engrossed in this moment where you have no idea what is even happening. And the way it flows naturally from Jessica having this incredibly trippy experience to Paul and Chani just kind of falling in love with each other, it's utterly bizarre, and it's wonderful. The scene later on where Paul drinks the essence of Shai Hulud and goes to this hidden place at the center of his mind, a place where nobody else can go. I honestly have no idea what even happened in this scene, and genuinely I am asking you, can somebody explain to me what the purpose of that scene was? Because I am completely lost after reading it. I don't know what this hidden place is inside his mind and what the message there is, what the hidden meaning is. I definitely felt like there was something I was missing there. And then finally, the last chapter in this book is just magnificent. I was surprised that Irulan only showed up for like 3 paragraphs at the very end. I figured she would have a bigger role, but I guess that's going to come in Dune Messiah. But man, I love the way Paul just completely dominates the Emperor and usurps his power. It all comes together so well, and it's going to be awesome seeing that interaction between Christopher Walken and Timothée Chalamet in the movie. The ending did feel very abrupt, which was surprising because I hear a lot of people saying that they just read Dune and don't read the other books. I don't think I could do that after reading that ending. That it feels like a lot of things were unresolved, even though Paul sort of achieved his main mission in this book. The overarching story arc about him trying to prevent the jihad is just left completely dangling. And it did not feel like a complete story. It feels like there's still stuff that needs to happen in order for me to feel satisfied with this ending. Okay, anyway, I could go on for ages about this book, but I think that gives at least some impression of what my opinions on this book are. I really loved it. I'm regretting not reading it earlier, but I am really glad I did now. I can definitely see myself reading it again someday because I feel like there's a lot of things I missed. And I am excited to go into Dune Messiah. Hopefully you will see a review of that sometime soon. And also, man, Dune Part 2, going off the trailers alone, it looks like it's going to be the best movie of the year easily. Perhaps the best movie of the decade, I don't know. All right, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like the video and subscribe if you enjoyed this. And yeah, see you around.